I'll introduce Karen Coates, but first a couple technical things about the webinar, things that many of you will already know. Please do use the chat box to pose questions while Karen talks. Just type it in and shoot it off to us, and I will be gathering up these questions, and she will pause during her webinar, during her talk, and answer those questions as she goes. And if you look at the attendee box, you'll see a smiley, and that if you click on that smiley, it'll give you a couple options. You can ask Karen to speak louder or more softly. You can agree or disagree with her, etc. So in any case, I'll just briefly introduce Karen. Karen Coates is an investigative journalist who has spent many years in Southeast Asia. She's author with photographer Jerry Redford of Eternal Harvest, The Legacy of American Bombs in Laos, a book about bombs that are still killing civilians in Laos 50 years after they were dropped. She has also filed stories from Southeast Asia about land grabbing, climate change, illegal logging, and many other social and environmental issues. She is a gourmet and wrote for Gourmet magazine and publishes a very successful foodie blog called The Rambling Spoon. So in any case, I won't ramble on anymore. Let's turn it over to you, Karen.
Okay, I was muted there for a second, and I'm not, and my picture just came up, so I'm hoping everyone can hear me here. Send a chat if there's a problem, I guess, because I'm not certain that I'm coming through.
Okay, Karen, I can hear you. Hopefully everyone else can.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining me here and asking me to do this, and please bear with me because I'm usually in front of a classroom doing something like this, and so it's kind of a bit strange for me to be speaking to my computer. I like to be, obviously in person with people, but I'm happy to talk to you today. I wanted to start out by sharing a story with you, because I think this particular story tells a lot about the way I tend to work, the way I tend to approach my issues and my stories when I'm on the ground. And it's called Youve's story. So this was about 15 years ago. My husband and I were traveling through northern Vietnam, just as tourists after living in Cambodia for a while. And we met this lovely little girl named Shu. She was about 10 years old at the time. She spoke really good English and half a dozen other languages, which she taught herself. And she wanted to be our guide. So she took us all around this incredibly beautiful area where she lives up near the Chinese border and showed us her life. And she took us home to meet her family. Here's her mother, and I think those might be her brothers. And she really pulled us into the story of what it's like to be Hmong in this part of Vietnam. In this region, the Hmong people are the majority population, but they're incredibly poor, remote, they're subsistence farmers, and they essentially have no real role in the local economy. They don't control the businesses there, which are mostly run by Vietnamese business people. And there are a lot of problems. There's a lot of extreme poverty and hunger and domestic violence and all sorts of other really troubling issues. And so girls especially don't have a chance to go to school. And girls like Shu end up walking hours each day to go into town to try to sell trinkets to tourists. So this is what she was doing when we met her, and we took her to dinner one night and realized she hadn't eaten all day. And this was, somewhat typical for her. If she didn't sell things, she wouldn't eat. So we spent, maybe a week in that area. Really, I just kind of fell in love with this little girl. went home and I wrote a story about her. It was an essay. It wasn't really, a newspaper style journalistic piece, although I did use the same sort of journalistic tools in writing about her and her life that I would any story. And it was published in a literary magazine, and it won an award, so that brought some attention to it, and I had it on my website. And then, out of the blue, time passed, years passed. We went home, went on with our lives. And then about 4 years ago, out of the blue, I got an email from Shu. So here she was, grown woman. She was Googling her name online and came across my story. And it just blew her away because she said, wow, it was amazing to read what I was like at 10 years old and what I was thinking at that time. And now, as a grown woman, she's a mother. She started a nonprofit organization, and she's in control of it. It was the first Hmong-operated nonprofit in the area, and she teaches young Hmong women English and tourism and business skills and cooking, and tries to get Hmong girls out of this cycle of poverty. So my husband and I went back to see her, and here she is having dinner with her daughter and some of the girls she works with. So I wrote about her again and included both stories, the beginning and the later story, in a collection of essays that I had published last year. And I share this with you because it really kind of summarizes the way I like to go about my reporting. I like to immerse myself in places. I like to be on the ground talking to people, really getting to know them, hearing their stories, their own views of their lives. And I've been doing this for about 20 years now. I actually started at a small town newspaper in Wyoming. But then when I was in grad school, I spent a semester in Vietnam. And that changed my life because I just fell in love with the place, the people, the culture, the food. And the next year, I decided I need to go back. I want to work in another country again. So I took a job at the Cambodia Daily in Phnom Penh. And my husband, we were newly married. He's a photographer, and all the pictures you see here today are by Jerry. We moved to Phnom Penh at a time when it was an incredibly difficult year. It was the end of the Khmer Rouge War. There was a lot of violence, a lot of extreme poverty, and that year also changed both of our lives. And we left shortly after the year ended, thinking we're not going to be back anytime soon. But we were completely wrong because we hadn't realized until we got home how much this affected us as people. And so we worked for a while again in the US, but then 9/11 happened. And we sort of looked at each other and said, it's clear to us that Americans aren't really grasping issues outside the US. And we wanted to try to do a better job of helping to explain the world to our fellow Americans. So we packed up again, put everything in storage, and moved back to Asia. Moved to Cambodia and then Thailand, and spent several years there using Thailand as a home base for reporting on food and environments and social issues and health all over the region. And then a few years ago, we decided, well, we should also keep some roots in the US, so we bought a house in New Mexico, but since then, we've still been splitting our time, reporting mostly in developing countries. So you can see that development issues have been a big part of my life and my career for 20 years now. And I hadn't really thought about it this way until I started preparing this webinar. But I got my first start in reporting on Native cultures and really immersing myself in a different culture when I was in college. I was part of a program called Native News, and this was in Montana, a very rural, sparsely populated state, and it has 7 Native American reservations. And the way that the class worked was that the journalism school took two students and paired us up. So we'd have one non-native student working with a native student. And the native student would take the other partner into the reservation, into their home, into the culture to really explain and share and give sort of an entree into the life there. And it wouldn't have worked any other way because, especially at that time, you know, native reservations here in the U.S. are they are independent nations, and they're also culturally isolated in many ways, for good reason and for understandable reasons. In that there's a lot of distrust, there's a lot of misunderstanding, and it's really hard for a non-native person to get access, or you know, a non-native reporter to get access to those places. And so by pairing us up and having a native person bring us into their world, that was really the only way that we could do meaningful interviews. And I didn't realize until just the other day that that experience has really, I think, formed the way I look at reporting today and the way that I have done most of my reporting. Because to me, it's, I like I've been saying, I like to try to get into and as close to other places and cultures as possible, even when I'm starting as an outsider. So how do you do that? It's a difficult question, especially for journalists if you're working on deadline, if you're working for a newspaper, or you're given an assignment from an editor telling you, okay, you need to report on this issue, or you need to somehow get the facts and get the information out of this place or these people, when there's a barrier, or you're strangers, or you don't really have that entree. So for me, I have sort of a different background from many reporters because I've spent so much time in other countries, actually living in them. And my method is to, you know, go into a place and hang out and be on the ground and spend time just observing and talking to people, talking to taxi drivers, talking to restaurant owners, talking to people on the streets, just going up and asking questions and really getting a feel for the place before I dive into a story or before I even define what my story is. And I realize that this is not practical for a lot of people who are working for a publication or on deadline in that sort of circumstance, because you simply don't have the time. But when it's possible, I highly recommend just really booking enough time, you know, a few days when you arrive in a place, just to sit back and take notes and write in a journal and think and try to get a sense of the place before you even begin reporting. And another good thing is to try to get to know local journalists. And I have, you know, this has been a part of my career throughout, because I started working for the Cambodia Daily, and I didn't realize what was happening at the time because it was my first real experience living and reporting as a journalist in another country. But I was building a network that it's impossible to have when you just show up as a tourist or you just show up as an outsider. By working for the local publication and making friends with other journalists who live there, grow up there, you're never going to get better information really than you will from good journalists on the ground. And even today, I get so many story ideas from the journalist friends and colleagues I've made through the years all over the world. So if you have that chance, I highly recommend doing that. Fixers. It's a term that we use all the time, we hear all the time, and I honestly I don't like it. I didn't even really know what that meant for several years. What's a fixer? Because when I started reporting in other countries, I wasn't using fixers. I was there and I was making friends, and my friends would take me out and say, "Look, I want you to meet these people. I want you to see what's going on here. I think there's a story here. I think you need to know this." But they weren't fixers in my mind. They were my friends and colleagues. And so it took me a long time to kind of grasp what people were really getting at when they started talking about fixers. And again, I understand that if you're coming from Europe or you're coming from the United States and you're assigned to do a story in Africa or in Asia or some other part of the world, it's not always practical to to find somebody locally. I mean, sometimes you have to you got to think, okay, so I'm sitting here in my office. I need to find a way into this country or this culture. And we have to go online and we have to try to search for people who can connect us to a place. But then once you're there and once you're hooked up with somebody, um, it's always best to try to really get to know them, to really understand who you're working with, and get to know them on a human level more than just someone you're hiring. Because the experiences I've had, I've found that if I'm working with a fixer, somebody to help me with translating and transportation and figuring things out, if that person is a stranger from the start and we never really develop a deep relationship, sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes there's mistrust, things go wrong. It always for me goes much better if the relationship starts on a deeper level. And also, again, if you can make friends with the people, or find journalists who you trust and can develop a long-term relationship with. So why is all of this so important to me? I think it really is about helping you find local voices and really understanding what happens in a place, in a culture. You know, one of the problems that I see in so much reporting, and not just in news reporting, but also in like NGO reports or government reports, UN reports, is that things are often drawn as black and white pictures, and life isn't that way. Stories aren't that way. Most stories are so much more complex than they often end up in print. And it's our job to try to find those voices that aren't often included in the complexity of a story, of the reality. So I want to give you another example. This is a story that I worked on in Laos about the Nam Ton Tu Dam. And actually, I wasn't in Laos working on a story about this dam in particular. I was there working on the book that my husband and I did on unexploded ordnance. But at the same time, there was this big dam project that was highly controversial. At the beginning, there were hopes that this would be a better dam than so many other dams that have been built in developing countries. But it involved flooding a massive area and relocating thousands of villagers. It's for hydroelectric power, and 95% of that power is going to Thailand. However, the people in the area, and many of them are minorities, were guaranteed electricity, and most of them hadn't had electricity before the dam went in. So this was a multi-year project, cost millions and millions of dollars, and it has been exceedingly controversial. And in retrospect, so the dam's been open for a couple of years, and I have not come across a single positive report among NGOs or government agencies or really news stories or anybody saying much good about this dam at all. So here we have, all this new electricity, but a lot of the stories center on complaints about minority populations who were relocated and never given the electricity they were promised, or their rice fields were flooded and they lost their livelihood and that hasn't been replaced, or things just haven't gone the way they were supposed to. So here's a family we talked to a couple of years after the dam opened, and they're sitting on the platform outside their thatch hut. So they were promised a new house. All the new housing was wood and concrete and very, very stable. But they hadn't received that house yet. So they were still waiting, but they weren't totally unhappy. Here is what some of the new houses look like on the inside. So this one is pretty elaborate. Concrete, you see that they have furniture and a TV and stereo and all sorts of things that they didn't have before when they were living in a thatch hut. And this guy here is standing outside that house, and it also has a little shop next to it. So he and his family used to be rice farmers. And then the dam came in, their place was flooded, they got this new house, and he no longer farms. He now drives a truck for the dam company. And he buys his rice in the market, which is grown somewhere else in the country. So here's the thing. When I started talking to him, after reading these reports and hearing of all of the negative things about this dam, I asked him, well, what do you think? Are you happy? Are you not? What do you think of not being able to grow your rice anymore? And he said he likes his job better now. And he actually doesn't mind not being a farmer because it was really hard work. So it wasn't a bad thing for him, but I hadn't heard that perspective in so many of the reports that came out. And then here is a woman who is standing in front of her new house. So she also was relocated, but she's still living on a farm, and she's clearing a new area to grow some food. But this is what's happened. And what I haven't seen in any of the negative reports about this dam, part of the whole dam project was to bring in a bomb clearance team to remove all of the unexploded ordnance left over from the US bombings 40, 50 years ago in all the areas where these villagers are resettled. So for the first time in this woman's life, she is able to farm on land that has no bombs. So she is able to work the land in a place she knows is safe. And she's incredibly happy about that. But again, I didn't see that aspect of the story brought up in so many news reports and so many NGO reports on the Nam Tuntu Dam. And this all gets back to my point about local voices and what I really try to make an effort of doing in my own reporting, which is to actually talk to people who are affected by the issues and the policies that we're reporting on. Because one of the biggest problems that I see in so much international reporting on development issues and minorities is that that locals, their voices aren't included. And I'm not always entirely sure why. I think a lot of the times the reporters start by going into a country and talking from the top up. But what's missed are the voices on the ground. Do we want to have a few questions or continue at this point? Brent, are there any questions or should I just keep going? Oh, can you hear me? I'm not hearing you. Okay, so there's a question here, how long it takes to research, write a story.
Okay, can you hear me
Um,
now?
yes, now I can hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. We had a technical problem. Okay, Karen, yeah, there have been a couple of questions about just how long it takes you, how much time you have to invest to research and write a story. And then one person wanted to know about the dam, how long it would have taken you to write up a story like that. And I'll just add,
Hmm.
there's also been questions about whether you see yourself as a journalist who writes specifically about, quote, vulnerable peoples.
Hmm.
And if the voices that are not heard that you mentioned in your slide, do you mean by that the voices of a minority or indigenous people?
Uh, Both good questions. So, in terms of how long it takes me to research or write a story, well, actually, those are two very different pieces to doing a story. So, the research part of it, including on the ground research, that varies so much because it could be anywhere from a few days to months or years or more. The book that my husband and I did on unexploded ordnance, all in all, that took 7 years to put together. But there also comes a point where um, you can just keep going and going and going because there's so much more to find, so much more information, so many more people to talk to, and so many stories that keep snowballing out of the initial research. So I think you have to decide, okay, what am I doing here? What am I commissioned to do? How much time do I realistically have? But I'm the sort of person who just actually usually spends way more time than I have time for. So it usually takes me quite a while. And then writing too, that's the second piece to it, and that's kind of all over the map. But and I usually procrastinate and leave everything to the last minute and then rush to try to fit it in. But a long form narrative will take, oh, I don't know. I mean, it depends. A week, 2 weeks. It really depends on the story. And vulnerable voices, vulnerable people. I do. I was thinking about this the other day that I've always kind of felt like I write for or about or kind of try to stick up for the underdog. And I'm not really sure why that is. I've just always kind of felt that way or done things that way. Even when I was a kid, I always tried to stand up for the underdog in life. So yeah, I do. I think that a lot of those voices not heard are minorities, but I use that term in a very broad sense because I think minority can be an ethnic population. It can be based on gender, but I think it's often very much defined by context. So the minority in a place, or the vulnerable voice in a place, is going to change depending on the context. Any other questions?
Okay, well, listen, why don't you carry on and I'll gather some more questions and then we can take another break in a
Okay.
few minutes.
Okay. So, yeah, getting back to local voices and trying to include them. Again, I think that when when I talk about talking to locals and getting local voices in, usually I do that first. But then, of course, I go home and I have to do a whole lot of research, like through academic reports, NGO reports, government reports, etc. And what I find is that a lot of the information that comes out of those sorts of sources is very different from the stories that I hear on the ground. So this sort of, again, underlines the importance in my mind of talking to the people, because I find that in a lot of cases, experts try to speak for people, to say that, this is what these people need, or this is what's wrong with the situation, but they're not necessarily speaking with the people. This has been my experience anyway, and it explains why the stories that I hear from folks on the ground are so different. And I'll give you another example. I do a lot of reporting on food security, and I'm also involved in a lot of scientific writing communities and academic writing communities in the United States. that focus on global food security and the question of how do we feed a future population of 9 billion people. I think we've all heard this big question. But what I find in the academic debates and the institutional debates in the US, the arguments are all centering on how do we increase production, how do we use new technologies to help people increase their yields, how do we produce more food to meet the demands of all of these people. But when I'm on the ground reporting, what I find is that that debate, in my mind, really is more of a debate about how do we feed the 8 billion people who already are eating, not about how do we feed the billion people who don't currently have enough food to eat. Because when I start talking to people in that population, their concerns are very different. It's not about, I need to grow more food. It's that I don't have a land title. I'm afraid that a company is going to come and take my land away. I'm afraid that the government is going to kick me off my land because they want it for something else. I don't have irrigation. And that's a political issue because the people in the province over there, controlled by, some bigwig in the government, they have irrigation. But our poor province doesn't have irrigation. So the immediate problems that I hear from people on the ground are very different from what I find in the reports that I read when I'm back home. So again, I think to me, it underlines why it's so important to actually get the voices of people who are experiencing the problems that we're writing about. So then, as a journalist, of course, the question is, well, how do we do that? I mean, how do we get funding to go to these places and talk to people on the ground when we're working for ourselves or we're working for a publication that has a limited budget, limited time, and it's really difficult. I mean, I'm talking about investing an awful lot in terms of time and money into getting the real stories on the ground. But how can we make that happen in the real world? Because we all have to work and make a living, and we all have bills to pay at home, right? So there are a lot of fellowships out there, and depending on where you are and what your situation is, you can do your own sort of search to find groups that give out fellowships and grants for international reporting or reporting on specific issues. And as a freelancer today, I think it's essential. And I'm finding too that as a freelancer, more and more of the baseline money and funding that is behind the projects that I do, it's institutional more than it is from publications. So there are groups like ICFJ, the International Center for Journalists, and they work with people all over the world. And I'm just going to point out a few groups here that have helped me in my reporting. So last summer, I had a grant from ICFJ to go to this area of Borneo called the Kelabit Highlands. And I'd been there, I don't know, maybe 6 years before that. And again, Jerry and I were just traveling, but we stumbled across several stories, which often happens whenever we travel. And we ended up in this remote highland area of minorities, in an area that's being logged pretty much all around it. And so the people were fighting to preserve their land because the tribal cultures there traditionally live by farming rice, but also hunting and foraging in the forests. And they saw what was happening all around them, where these forests were disappearing. There were also a bunch of archaeological sites in the area that hadn't really been studied. And so with the encroachment of logging, people were afraid that these historical sites, which had these deep ties to their ancestors, would be destroyed. So I always wondered what happened there, because writing about food at the time, I did a series of stories on jungle food, and I was just blown away by the amazing variety of things that people were pulling out of the jungle to eat, and the biodiversity there is just incredible. So, um, you know, I always wondered what happened, and I thought it would be great to go back and follow up. So I applied for an ICFJ grant and got that last summer, and was able to go back for a few weeks, revisit some of the same people I met years before that. And it ended up being a good story in many ways because since I'd been there the first time, the government set up sort of a buffer zone. So the logging had not, come any closer to these villages. And even though they're still worried about the future, they weren't as worried as 6 years earlier. So in that way, it was a good story. And I came away with a piece for archaeology and a travel story for the New York Times, and another multimedia piece for an online site called SciDev. And it was just really great to be able to go back and follow up. Okay, so I'm getting a question here. Let's see. How do you break ice with subjects? I'm going to get to that in a minute. And let's see, also advice for TV journalists who only has a few hours per subject. Yeah, that's a that's a really good question. And I got to say, I have no background in TV, but that's hard because sometimes you do only have a few hours. And I guess I would say that if that is all you have with one subject, then do as much as you can on the outside. I mean, find if you can interview other sources who know that person, or if you can do other research to sort of add to, elaborate on what that person says, or who that person is, to try to sort of beef up the interview. But yeah, it's a tough question. And then, do I use real identities? That's a really good question too. I almost always do, unless the person doesn't want to be identified as such. Or the other thing that happens in most of the places where I report, lots of people go by, well, nicknames, or their friends will know them as one thing. Or like in Cambodia, everybody abbreviates their name. So you could call somebody Rit, and that could be 50 people in in a square mile. But I also think, there have been many times when people have not asked me to conceal their identity, but I have anyway, because I might know something more than they do, especially if I'm talking to people in really rural areas on a sensitive topic, or a country like Laos, which is communist. I might go ahead and give them a nickname or shorten their own name without fully revealing their identity, because I know, based on what other people have told me, that what they're saying, even though they tell me, I want you to print this, I know it could be dangerous for them if someone, or if the wrong person hears what they're saying. And sometimes I think that they don't necessarily know that. But then there's also, it can be a fine line about, when should you make that decision for somebody else? You don't want to
Karen, I have a couple of additional questions now. I'll chime in. One
Sure.
question about if you feel, let's say, obliged or obligated in any way. I mean, you accept money from foundations or other organizations supporting you, certainly for something like your book that took 7 years to research. Do you ever feel compromised when you accept money from an outside source like a foundation, or that obviously has some kind of agenda?
Right. And that's a really good question too. So groups like ICFJ, I mean, it is a journalism organization, even though, of course, every journalism organization has backers from other groups. But I think they try to do a pretty good job of not letting the funding influence editorial. or like this, SCJ, which is the Society of Environmental Journalists, they have a fund for reporting on the environment. And they're, I think it's important to think about where the money is coming from and how the organization handles it and what their policy is. I mean, some groups are not as strict about keeping a barrier between the funding and the goals of the people who are giving money and the outcome of it. I mean, I like to think that a lot of these groups maintain that barrier, and that the people who fund them understand the importance of that barrier. But that doesn't always happen that way. And working for publications can be a different sort of scenario. And I actually haven't had this problem too much. I know lots of other people who do, where they feel like they're not able to write what really needs to be written because somebody with a lot of money doesn't like it. So it's not. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, Karen, we had the question about using the real identities of people, using their pictures, naming names, and then we had a follow-up question on that as to whether you sometimes find that you're getting personally involved with a subject, with a family or community you get to know and you do a story on, and if that can create some problems, and if they maybe ever approach you and ask for help in some form.
Yeah.
In some form other than writing a story about them.
Yeah, that happens all the time. And I think it would be nearly impossible, especially to go to some countries and not have that happen because, especially if you're talking to a remote population that doesn't often see visitors or have the chance to talk to outsiders, you show up asking questions and immediately they think, well, maybe this person can help me. Maybe this person has money. Maybe this person can change my life. So I explain that I'm not an organization. I'm not an NGO, but my job and the way that I could try to help them is by writing their story and by writing, the reality of the situation and informing people. And usually that helps and people understand that. I don't, sometimes people ask to be paid for interviews. I don't pay for interviews as an ethical, stand. I don't pay for interviews, but if you're in a village and people are accommodating you and feeding you meals or giving you tea or whatever, leaving a few dollars or doing something like that, I think that's normal. That's human. I mean, I kind of do what I would do in any normal human situation. You don't want to be rude. In the same way that, like in J school, journalism school, we were always told, well, don't absolutely never take food or drink or anything from sources, which can be good advice in certain circumstances. But if you're in a village somewhere and people invite you in for dinner, and it would be completely rude to refuse, I don't think you should refuse. So I will leave a little bit here and there if
Karen, I'll let you carry on now, and then we'll gather up some more questions for further on in the webinar.
Okay. So going through organizations, FIJ, Fund for Investigative Journalism. This is another group that helped fund the book that I worked on. But then there are also things like crowdfunding campaigns. Now, I haven't done this, but a good friend of mine just did this one called Touching Home in China, where she adopted a girl from China years ago, and she's now 16, and she went back to China. And so they're doing this big project on what it was like for her to go back to the place where she was born and abandoned. And they had this successful crowdfunding campaign. Now, I know lots of people who have done crowdfunding journalism campaigns, and to be honest, every person I've talked to said I won't do that again for various reasons. It's really exhausting. Often it's hard, for a lot of us to ask people for money constantly. But the other thing is that a lot of people have said, well, you end up asking your family and friends, and it's mostly other journalists who end up donating to the campaign, and you can't really keep doing that, you know, year after year, asking other journalists to fund journalism. So it has issues, but it has been a way for a lot of people I know to at least get started initially on a single project. Another way that I've found to get funding to travel to places, find stories, meet people, report on issues is through teaching. So, for example, I've done a lot of media training in Southeast Asia, and then a couple of years ago, this group IREX hired me to go to Azerbaijan to do some storytelling training. And this was a part of the world I'd never been to before, never thought, you know, I wasn't planning on going there, but the person they had hired couldn't do it, and they were looking for somebody, and I thought, wow, that sounds really interesting. So I took the job and ended up going back 2 more times. It probably won't happen again because the government's really cracked down on journalism there and on IREX, but it was such a fantastic experience and such a great way to get to know the issues on the ground. And a lot of these things that I'm talking about are, you know, workshops can be like just a few days, so it's not like you're taking on a whole new job, but it's a great introduction to a place and the people and the issues there, especially if you're doing something like media training, because again, you're talking to people who are really well connected and understand what's going on around them. So let me just move along here to getting connected. And if, you know, we've been talking about how to get an entree into places, how to fund your trip to a place, how to get connected with people. But if you can't travel, what can you do? Or if, you know, if you have to build up sort of a network before you begin to travel, what can you do to really get connected to issues that are important locally? Professional organizations, I think, are absolutely critical in today's journalism world. In our, you know, greatly widely connected internet world, groups like the Global Investigative Journalism Network has folks all over the world, and that, you know, you sign up for a listserv and you're constantly getting messages about people working on specific issues. They need sources, or can you help me with this, that, or the other thing. So it's a really great way to get entree into a place or an issue. And then looking at your own personal interests. So for me, food, I belong to the Association of Food Journalists, which is just, you know, and maybe you're into music or art or whatever, but pretty much every niche in journalism has its own professional organization. So, and then every year there are annual conferences, which are expensive. I just came back from one, but they make up for their price, because there's just nothing like meeting so many people who are working in the same area as you face to face in one spot, and it's exhausting, but it's, you know, constant networking. And then, okay, so this is JAWS, the Journalism and Women Symposium. And I joined this group a few months ago, and this was the conference I just came back from in California, and I was just blown away by how great it was. So, and I think it's mostly based in the US, but they do have some international members. But what I really like about this group is that it's, being all women, their focus is really on diversity and expanding conversations in journalism to not just women, but minorities and very diverse groups. Okay, so another question here. Do you travel on a tourist or journalist visa? And how do you sell development stories to an American or other audience? Okay, so I almost always travel on a on a tourist visa, not journalist, because, well, lots of reasons. In a lot of countries, if you have a journalist visa, you are constantly watched. You are limited in what you can do and where you can go and who you can talk to. You're often followed, and you have a shorter time limit in the country. So I almost always try to get a journalist visa. Sometimes I get a business visa if that's necessary, but because sometimes it's actually easier to stay longer on a business visa. But almost all the reporting I do is pretty much under the radar, and I try to look like a tourist. But again, you know, it depends on the country and the circumstances in wherever you're going. How to sell development stories to an American or other audience, that is that is one of the toughest questions I face in my day-to-day working life, because especially in America, I think, you know, it might be better in Europe, but it's really hard in America to garner up interest for anything outside the US that people can't relate to directly. And so that's the key. And I'm actually going to jump ahead here to answer that question. The key in, where'd it go? Well, anyway, the key is to try to find a way to connect to your audience, to bring an issue to an audience that you wouldn't necessarily have. But okay, so I'm going to show you an example of a story that I did that was related to my book on unexploded ordnance in Laos, which is not an issue that most Americans, you know, hear about, care about, pay a whole lot of attention to. And then there was this big debate in Canada over cluster munitions and the Canadian law about cluster munitions. So, and again, that's a really, you know, niche sort of political issue. But I ended up writing an essay about this for a online women's magazine called Dame. And I wrote it in a way from the perspective of mothers and children who find cluster munitions in their fields in Laos. So the key here was to write in a very personal way, to you know, connect, find the human level. So it's an audience of women, and the site actually has a lot of like celebrity news and those sorts of like stories on hair and makeup and things like that. So how do you bring politics into that arena? But if you can find something that connects the people to that deeper issue, then you've also built up an audience for yourself that you can hopefully bring along to your next story. So that's, yeah, it's one of my biggest struggles, and I'm constantly trying to figure out how to do this. Okay, one more question here. Pros and cons of being a freelancer. Well, the biggest con is a lack of a stable paycheck, and that is also a constant struggle, and it's exhausting, and constantly having to do everything. And you know, people say freelancing, you get to set your own hours, you can work in your pajamas or whatever. On one level, yes, but then on another level, I'm working for editors and publishers all over the world, and so in some ways I don't have off time. If you know, if I'm working for somebody in Asia, or you know, trying to, I did a Skype interview a couple of weeks ago at 3 o'clock in the morning. I set my alarm, got up, you know, stumbled to my desk and did this in-depth Skype interview with somebody in Cambodia at 3 o'clock in the morning, and then went back to bed for a bit. So it's exhausting, and it's not, you know, I feel like I don't get many real vacations, but it's incredibly free and liberating in that I can cover the stories I want to cover, and I'm not, you know, being told what to do by somebody else. I find the stories that I want to do for the most part, and then sell them to somebody. And I do get assignments, but they're usually from people I've been working with for a while, and so they know my interests, and they give me stories that they know I'll want to do. Okay. So, any other questions at the moment, or should I back up? Okay. So we went through professional organizations. Okay. So you're there. You're on the ground. You have found a way to get to the place where you want to go, find the people you want to report on or the issue you want to report on. You have funding or whatever. What do you do? How do you report the story? Well, the first thing I think is finding a doorway. And by that I mean find some way to connect to people and what's important to them as people locally. So for me, you know, my interest in food, I never set out to be a food reporter, but it just kind of happened that way. I also like to cook and eat. But every time I started going out to talk to people in Southeast Asia, they'd want to feed me, they'd want to bring me tea because you know, it's sort of protocol, it's cultural protocol. You invite somebody into your community and you serve them tea. So you sit down and you know, you have a conversation that begins there. So find whatever common ground or whatever, you know, whatever the thing is in the place where you are that opens people up. So maybe it isn't food, maybe it's music, maybe you have a mutual interest in music or art, or maybe the person has a kid who's the same age as your kid, or maybe it's soccer, you know, it's sports, football. But start there before you start asking the tough questions. Relate to the people on a human level. And the other key about this in my reporting is that I talk about bottoms-up reporting. So, and it's a method that's different from a lot of American or, you know, Western reporters I know who go to places to, you know, developing countries to report for a while, where they land and then their first interviews are with officials or NGO directors, or they say, you know, I got to set up an appointment with this person. Whereas my method is to not set up appointments, at least not in the beginning. My method is to go and walk around on the street and just start conversations with people. Sit down, you know, along the riverbank in Phnom Penh and just start talking to the person next to me. Now, if there's a language barrier, that can be difficult, but often you also find people who speak English, or if you're working with someone, have a friend there, or a translator or something, they can help you with this. But also just observing, watching what goes on, and then taking the story or taking the issue from there. So why do I work this way? Because for one thing, if you start at the top, if you start with the head of an NGO or anybody in government anywhere, the chances of you being cut off earlier are much greater. So if somebody doesn't like what you're doing or what you're onto for whatever reason, they're much more likely to just stop conversation before you have a chance to go any further. And also because what they tell you might be very different from, again, what's important to people on the ground. And you might never get to that point where you know what the important issues are for the people on the ground if you start at the top and then formulate your questions with officials from there. Questions?
Yeah, couple questions coming in now. One is, when it comes to pitching stories, do you pitch these stories before you head off, before you set out for wherever you're going, or do you pitch the stories once you get there?
It's a mix. My preferred method is actually to pitch after I've been there a while, but that's not always practical, and financially it's not always possible, because often, you know, you need an assignment to make sure that you have a way to do the story and pay the bills and all of that. But the problem that I find in trying to pitch a story sometimes before I get there is sometimes the story is totally different when you get on the ground. So for example, I had this ICFJ grant last year to go to Borneo. Before I left the US, everybody was telling me, oh, you should do something on palm oil, palm oil, palm oil, and how that's affecting this community where I was going. And, you know, I looked for research on palm oil in the Kelabit Highlands and just wasn't finding anything, but I didn't know why, but I knew that palm oil is a big issue. But I didn't pitch that story, even though lots of people were advising me to. I got there and I found out that actually the palm trees don't grow that high up at that elevation. So that's why it's not an issue in that particular area. Had I pitched that before, I would have been in big trouble. I wouldn't have had that story. But I got there and found all sorts of other stories that I wasn't expecting. So another thing that I'll do is just, before I go somewhere, tell editors that I know, or even strangers, editors I haven't worked with before, just say, hey, I have this grant to report in this region. I'm generally looking at these particular topics. Let's talk. If it does any of this interest you, and often it does, and often they're very responsive.
There's also been a question about security. You were in Cambodia at a very turbulent time. There's been a lot of violence recently as well. And how do you, as a woman and a foreigner, deal with security issues?
That's a really good question. That first year when I was in Cambodia, I developed an instinct that I don't think I had before then. Both my husband and I did. And, I was there, my husband was there too, not that we were together all the time. But
I'm not sure everyone in the audience will realize your husband, Jerry Redfern, is also the photographer, the co-author of your book. So you have been a team for many years now. Just to remind them all of that.
Yeah, thank you. But yeah, I mean, it became instinct to be aware of people around me, be aware of, footsteps behind me if I'm walking down the street at night, or, keeping my purse across my body instead of, hanging off my shoulder. And I ended up in some really violent situations. We were both shot at several times. We were held up at gunpoint several times. And that's part of the reason why we left. And, wow, sometimes you end up in a situation like that, and it's just really scary. But
could I elaborate just a bit?
Yeah,
because I'm curious, sure. When you say that you were held up and you were, etc. I mean, was any of the violent things that happened to you were any of these things related to your reporting?
Yes. So I went to cover, it was right after the elections in 1998, and then for about a month afterward, there were really violent protests. So one day, there was a crowd gathered in front of the U.S. Embassy, and all of us journalists had heard that something was going to happen, but nobody really knew what. Well, what ended up happening was totally unexpected. This drunken soldier came to the corner with an AK-47 and just fired off his whole clip. And everybody in the area dropped to the ground, and a few people ran away as they could. Luckily, nobody was shot there, but it was one of the scariest things that's ever happened to me. And then the other thing, another day I was reporting on a peaceful Buddhist monk protest where they were just marching through the streets peacefully, but then the cops showed up and there was a stampede, and I ended up on the bottom of a pile of monks as cops were beating people with their batons all around me. And then the monks cleared away, and I looked up, and there was a guy pointing his gun at me, but he just basically said, "Go away." So
we did have another question about security. I mean, how do you keep a low profile, or do you? I mean, how can you do that when you're out there taking notes, recording in the field?
Yeah. Taking notes, obviously, if you have a notebook in your hand or record, and I wasn't doing audio at that point, so I wasn't recording, but having a notebook, it depends on the place, because some cultures, having a notebook out isn't a big deal, but like say in Myanmar years ago, having a notebook out, that people would see that. So I would try to hide it a lot, or, there was a lot of writing that I didn't do in public. I just have to, try to remember scenes, or try to, scoot away somewhere where I could write in private. But part of keeping a low profile too, that's the other thing with the way I tend to report by just talking to people. I dress like a tourist, I act like a tourist. So I'm often just, people think that I probably am a tourist. Whereas if I were to show up and suddenly start talking to anybody in government or in uniform, I'd be watched immediately. So it does have its benefits that way too at times.
Karen, do you want to carry on a bit, or answer more questions? We've got about almost about 12 minutes left in our webinar.
Okay, well, I did just want to talk about this issue of the chance to speak. So, you know, when I think about why I do the reporting that I do, it's because I feel that there are a lot of people who don't have the chance to tell their stories. And I find this so often when I go out to areas, especially that haven't had visitors before, really, this eagerness to say, wow, you want to hear my story. You want to tell your country my story. They want to talk. And this is a problem that I've had often, not always, but often when I'm working with NGOs, or when I shouldn't say working with, because I don't work with NGOs, but if I go to a place and say, I'm working on a story here, do you know anybody I can talk to? And this happened in Laos a lot, working on the UXO book, where NGOs would try to protect their clients from people who wanted to talk to them, and they were very wary of giving me access to anybody. But then I just go out and find those same people myself and find out actually they really wanted to talk to me. So it was almost like the NGO was trying to protect them, but they didn't want that protection, which I always found really interesting. And there was one guy I interviewed, and I always remember him. His name was Kampa, and he was in a village somewhere. We showed up. We did these long interviews for a few days, and just as we were leaving, he came running up to the van and said, "Don't forget to tell America." He wanted me to go home and tell everybody I knew in the United States his story and his village's story about all these bombs in their fields. So I think of him all the time because this is a guy in a very remote place who doesn't normally have a chance to speak. So I just, and I wanted to insert that, and also just that caution about NGOs and thinking about if they're trying to protect people, if they really want that protection. Are there more questions, or should I?
Yes, I have a couple more questions. If you want to field them now, we are getting near to the end. There's been a question about the phenomenon known as compassion fatigue. And what is your experience of that over the years, compassion fatigue?
Actually, I haven't heard a whole lot that term used. So first, why don't you describe to me what you mean by it?
Well, I think that given the flood of stories that people are just bombarded now with media, and it's taken so many different forms in social media, etc., that maybe something terrible can happen. There's something terrible that needs to be reported on or covered. Let's take, for example, your book about the unexploded ordnance. It's quite extraordinary. This was the most bombed country in history, and many of these bombs are still killing people. But there's so many other stories now, and when I say compassion fatigue, I mean a lot of stories competing for people's attention, so to speak.
Yeah, it's incredibly hard as a journalist, especially as a freelancer, because it's absolutely true. And I even go through that too, thinking about those crowdfunding campaigns that I know so many journalists doing, where I get notices all the time, I'm doing this project, can you please donate? And I think, well, it's really worthy and I'd love to, but I can't give to everybody in the same way that an audience can't give their time or their eyes to every story. I'm not sure that I have a great answer about getting around that, except finding a particular way into a particular audience. So, with the UXO story, we did that as a book, but we also did articles that were pointed in so many different directions, focusing on women, focusing on kids, focusing on politics. So Henry Kissinger had a book out recently, and he was doing these interviews across the country, basically saying, there weren't so many human casualties or civilian casualties in Cambodia during the bombings, and in Laos too, but he didn't mention Laos. So we wrote political pieces based on his comments. So always finding, some way to just get into that particular audience, and then broadening the audience too as much as you can. But it's tough.
We had a question about accommodation, something very basic. You arrive
Hmm.
someplace and you want to report on a local community, maybe indigenous people or whatever.
Hmm.
What do you do about accommodation? Do you ask them to put you up? Do you accept if someone invites you? Do you find your own digs?
Yeah, it all depends on the place. So if it's a town and there are guest houses, usually where I travel, there's at least one guest house if it's in a town. So, I book my own room and that's that. If it's in a remote village, yeah, I mean, sometimes there is no other choice but to stay with people, and often people are very happy to have you come into their house because it's also a way for them to make some money. I mean, I wouldn't just stay there and take that for granted. I would pay them like I would, anybody else running a guest house. So it can be a side income for them. There have been other, I've camped, I've slept, on a cot in a health center in rural Laos, that sort of thing. So it really depends. But in most towns, you can online anymore. You can even book places in advance sometimes.
There have been also a couple of questions about your what kind of equipment you have in the field. You mentioned taking notes,
Hmm.
and has that changed over the years? Because your book is kind of a traditional narrative work,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of pressure to do multimedia, and of course
Yes.
you've been working with your husband, the photographer, for all these years. I mean, how in terms of the, let's say, just what you equip yourselves with in the field, how is that changing?
Yeah, so I'm still pretty old-fashioned and I actually like to take notes by hand. So I usually travel with a journal where I sit down at night and do my long form writing, and I also then have little notebooks that I take to the field for, interviews, day-to-day stuff. But of course, I've been doing more multimedia in the last few years, as everybody has. So I have a professional recorder and microphone and headphones and all that. My husband, Jerry, does video. I really don't do many photos except for now, I take photos on my iPhone for my blog and Instagram and stuff like that, mostly for like my foodie audience. Um, and he does more of the visual stuff. It's even hard for us with that division with two people doing those things to try to balance everything. Trying to do it all as one person, I can't even imagine. And all I can say is that some stories are only going to be print, or some stories are only going to be audio, or some stories are only going to be video because that's all you can really handle and do well. I mean, you can do a mediocre job on all of it, but is that what you want, or would you rather do one really great story in one format?
And
So
have
it's
you done
hard.
some, yeah, have you worked on some stories? I mean, this is a question of my own, but where you thought, I've written this up, this is great, but I could do something else with video. I mean, do you now think about that because our civilization is so dominated by images now that maybe there's certain stories that one could better do with your husband? You should turn it over to Jerry or for photos or
Yeah,
video. And then how do you two communicate about that?
yeah, that's always tough too. I mean, and looking back, there are lots of things that I think, wow, if we had that on video at the time, or there's so much that I could do visually or through the sounds, through the audio. Well, you can't go back in time, but what I also end up doing a lot, and this isn't because I tend to work on really big long-term projects, it works better than for somebody on deadline. But I will often draw from things that I did 10 years ago, maybe, and just insert parts of that into a larger project now. So if I'm working on something that involves multimedia now, I might still go back to the notes that I took, or Jerry will go back to the images he took years ago. We did an audio slideshow for SciDev um, a while ago, and he brought together, it was on roads and the development of roads globally, and so he brought together images that he'd taken over a dozen years all over the place on road construction. So I think that's one great thing about the way the journalism world has changed, is that there are more opportunities to do that sort of thing where you can draw on your whole body of experience.
We also have a question about working with children. Children feature a lot in your stories and in your book. Do you have any specific advice about how to deal with children? And Is it okay to publish photos? I mean, are there any concerns about their security?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a big issue, and I guess sometimes you think coming from America, where you think you have to get permission from parents and all that. Well, sometimes you're in a place where, say, a child is on the street, doesn't have parents. So how do you get permission from the parents if the kid never even knew his parents or whatever? Um, I think some of the main fundamentals are always, make sure that if you're talking to them, or if they're talking to you, that they want to talk to you. I mean, I don't push interviews with anybody who is scared, or clearly doesn't want to talk, or doesn't understand that this could go out to the world in some way. So just make sure that that they're clear in what you're doing, and that that if they want their identity known, if they don't want it known, to not use their identity, or not show them if they don't want to be seen.
Karen, we're coming into the final seconds. Is there something you'd like to add here at the end?
Well, I guess I want to say that I'm glad I had the chance to do this, and I wish I could talk to all of you in person. I'd love to hear your stories. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch. But also, thank you for letting me do this, because it's also kind of re-inspired me and reminded me why I do all these things that I do, because this can be a really difficult career, and so sometimes it's easy to think, oh my God, it's kind of overwhelming and hard. But when you put it all together and look at why, it's really important, and I just feel strongly about getting out there and talking to people on the ground to find the truth of what's happening in their lives.
Okay, well, on behalf of all our participants from many countries, thanks so much for this fascinating webinar. It's been a very meaningful addition to our course.
Thank you.
And I hope everyone will join me. This was Martin's suggestion last time. Let's all hit the smiley face. Hit the applause button now. I agree. There we go. Well, thanks again for joining us.